My friends, I want you to close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you are standing on a crowded, muddy street in the heart of Paris in the year 1837. The air is thick and heavy. It smells of wet stone, expensive coal smoke, and the sweat of thousands of working horses. The city is a beast that never sleeps, filled with the loud clatter of wooden wheels on uneven cobblestones. Now, look down at the sidewalk. A young man stands there, frozen in front of a grand wooden door. His clothes are thin, gray, and torn by the winter wind. His shoes are no longer shoes. They are scraps of leather held together by pieces of old string. If you look closely, you can see the red stains of blood on the fabric near his ankles. He has walked for 2 long years to reach this very spot. He has no money in his pockets, and his stomach has been empty for more days than he can count. He is a stranger in a city that does not care about his name. But inside his chest, there is a fire that the cold rain cannot put out. He carries a dream that is more valuable than all the gold in the French banks. This boy, who the world sees as a beggar, is about to change the history of travel forever. He is about to invent a way for the world to carry its dreams across oceans and continents. But before he was a king of luxury, he was a boy with nothing. Are you ready to journey with me back to the beginning? Let's go back far back into the mists of time to see how this long walk began. In the early 19th century, the world moved at the speed of a walking horse. Most people never traveled more than 10 miles from the house where they were born. For them, the horizon was a wall they never tried to climb. But Louis was different from the moment he could breathe the mountain air. He lived in a time when the gap between the rich and the poor was like a deep canyon. The rich traveled in heavy carriages filled with silk and silver, while the poor worked the soil until their hands became like the earth itself. On this rainy day in Paris, Louis feels that gap in his very bones. He looks at the grand workshop of Monsieur Maréchal and feels like a tiny insect looking at a mountain. Every muscle in his legs is screaming for him to sit down and give up. He remembers the cold nights sleeping under bridges and the taste of stolen apples. He remembers the faces of people who called him a worthless wanderer. A small voice in his head whispers that he does not belong in this city of light. It tells him to turn around and walk back to the mountains. But Louis knows that he cannot go back because the home he once loved is gone forever. He takes a deep breath of the dirty city air and reaches out his hand to knock on the heavy oak door. This is the moment when his old life ends and his legend begins. He is not just a boy looking for a job, he is a soul looking for a purpose. The door begins to creak open, and the smell of fresh wood and expensive glue hits his face. It is the smell of his future. Louis was born in 1821 in a tiny, quiet village called Angers. It was hidden deep in the rocky Jura mountains of eastern France, a place where the winter lasts longer than the summer. In Angers, the mountains are like giant walls of blue stone that touch the clouds. His family were humble farmers and woodworkers who had lived in those mountains for generations. They were people of the forest, people who understood the language of trees. The sound of a heavy axe hitting wood was the first music Louis ever heard. As a small child, he did not play with expensive toys or read books of poetry. Instead, he played with the golden shavings of wood on the floor of his father's workshop. He watched his father, Xavier, move a sharp plane across a piece of oak with the grace of a dancer. He learned that every tree has a story to tell. Some wood is soft and kind, while other wood is hard and stubborn like a winter storm. He learned that if you respect the wood, it will become whatever you imagine. His father taught him that a man's hands are his greatest tools, but only if they are guided by a patient heart. Those early years were filled with the warmth of the family fire and the smell of baking bread. Louis felt safe within the circle of the mountains and the love of his mother. But the peace of the mountains did not last long for the young boy. In 1831, when Louis was only 10 years old, a dark shadow fell over his home. His mother, the person who gave him his first sense of wonder, passed away unexpectedly. The house suddenly became cold and silent, as if the sun had forgotten to rise over Angers. Shortly after, his father married a new woman to help manage the farm. This new stepmother did not have a heart of wood. She had a heart of cold iron. She was a strict woman who saw Louis not as a son, but as a burden that needed to be controlled. Every morning, he was woken up before the sun to perform the hardest chores. He carried heavy buckets of water until his shoulders burned. He worked in the fields until his fingernails were broken and black with dirt. If he made a small mistake, the punishment was swift and loud. The home that once smelled of love now smelled of fear and resentment. Louis began to feel like a prisoner in the very place he was born. He realized that the mountains were no longer protecting him. They were trapping him. He spent his few minutes of rest staring at the mountain pass, the narrow opening that led to the rest of France. One evening, after a particularly bitter argument with his stepmother, Louis sat by the edge of a stream. He watched a single leaf fall into the water and get carried away by the current. The leaf did not fight the water. It allowed the river to take it to a new place. Louis realized that he was like that leaf. If he stayed in Ankei, he would become a bitter man with a broken spirit. He would spend his whole life working a farm that did not belong to him. He felt a deep, existential crisis that many of us feel when we are in the wrong place. He knew that there was a bigger world waiting for him, a world of machines, cities, and possibilities. He did not know how to get there, and he did not have a map. All he had was the resilience he had learned from the mountain oak trees. He decided that he would rather die on the road to a better life than live a long life of sadness in his village. That night, he packed a small piece of bread and a few basic tools into a cloth bag. He did not say goodbye to his father, fearing that the man's sadness would make him stay. At the age of 13, with the stars as his only guides, Louis Vuitton walked away from the only world he had ever known. He did not look back, even when the lights of Ankei disappeared behind the trees. He was alone, he was young, and he was finally free. The road to Paris was not a path of glory. It was a path of survival and deep, biting hunger. Every step Louis took away from his village was a step into a world that did not know his name and did not care about his survival. For a 13-year-old boy, the vastness of the French countryside was both beautiful and terrifying. He walked through thick, ancient forests where the sunlight barely touched the ground and over frozen hills that seemed to stretch forever toward the horizon. He carried the heavy silence of the mountains with him, but soon that silence was replaced by the growling of his empty stomach. Louis quickly learned that freedom had a very high price. He had no money for inns, so he stopped at lonely, isolated farms to beg for scraps of dry bread or a cup of watered-down milk. Often he was met with cold stares or barking dogs. The farmer saw only a dirty, wandering boy, not a future master of craft. He spent his nights sleeping in cold haystacks, shivering as the frost covered his thin coat, or huddled under the silent, uncaring stars. To earn a few coins for a bowl of soup, he took any job he could find along the dusty roads. He cleaned dirty stables, shoveling manure for hours until his arms felt like lead. He carried heavy stones for local builders, his small frame bending under the weight. Each small job was a lesson in pain, but it also taught him about the materials of the world, the weight of stone, the grit of sand, and the stubbornness of iron. One particularly bitter winter evening, Louis found himself in a small gray town near the city of Lyon. He was exhausted, his feet were swollen, and he had not eaten a real meal in 3 days. He approached a local carpenter shop, hoping to trade a night of hard labor for a warm place to sleep. The master carpenter, a man with a face like cracked leather, looked at Louis's trembling hands and laughed. He told Louis that a mountain runt would never have the strength to survive the winter road to Paris, let alone handle real tools. He pushed Louis back into the street and locked the door with a heavy iron key. Doubt began to grow in Louis's mind like a dark, suffocating shadow. He sat by a small, dying fire he had built with wet twigs, watching the orange sparks disappear into the black sky. "Is this the end of my journey?" he whispered quietly to the cold wind. For the first time since leaving Angers, he felt the crushing weight of failure. He thought about the warmth of his father's fireplace and the simple safety of the farm, even with his cruel stepmother. He wondered if he was being foolish, chasing a dream that was too big for a boy with no shoes. The freezing rain began to fall, turning the dirt road into a river of mud. Louis looked at his hands calloused, dirty, and red from the cold. He realized that this moment was his first true test. Failure was not losing a job or being hungry. Failure was choosing to stop. He remembered the oak trees in his village, how they bent in the mountain storms but never snapped. He realized that the road was not just moving him toward a city. It was carving away the boy to find the man underneath. He stood up, his joints aching, and shook the snow from his thin coat. He did not turn back toward the mountains. Instead, he took one slow, heavy step north, then another. The road was still long, but his heart had become as hard as the wood he loved. When Louis finally reached the gates of Paris, he did not find a city made of gold and light. Instead, he found a terrifying world of black smoke, loud noises, and extreme poverty that shocked his mountain soul. The Paris of the 1830s was not the beautiful city we know today. It was a crowded, dangerous labyrinth of narrow streets and dark secrets. Louis was a homeless foreigner in his own country, lost in a sea of millions of strangers who didn't care if he lived or died. He spent his first nights in the capital sleeping in cold, damp alleys, listening to the sound of large rats and the constant, heavy rain hitting the cobblestones. The hunger in his stomach was no longer just a feeling. It was a sharp, biting pain that never seemed to go away. Every day, he walked past bakeries smelling of fresh bread, but he had nothing to offer but his hunger. He saw many other young men who had come to the city with dreams, only to give up and disappear into the shadows of crime or despair. This was his lowest emotional moment, a true crisis of the spirit where the weight of the world felt too heavy to carry. He realized that in a place like Paris, you were either a master of a craft or you were absolutely nothing. With his last bit of energy, he began visiting the workshops of the laitiers. These were the specialist craftsmen who made custom wooden boxes and packed trunks for the wealthy elite. It was a very difficult, dirty, and physically demanding business that required great strength and even greater patience. One rainy afternoon, he walked into the busy workshop of Monsieur Maréchal. The air inside was thick with the suffocating smell of glue, sawdust, and expensive leather. Maréchal was a busy man who had no time for beggars, but when he looked at the dirty boy with the bleeding feet, he stopped. He saw something unusual in Louis's face, a quiet, burning focus, and a strange kind of dignity that the road had not been able to break. Louis did not beg for food. He asked for work. Maréchal hired him for the lowest position in the shop, a job that paid almost nothing. For months, Louis worked 14 hours a day, sweeping floors and carrying heavy planks of oak until his back ached with every breath. He lived in a tiny, unheated room above the shop, eating only enough to stay alive. He was surrounded by beautiful things he could not touch and wealth he could not imagine. The crisis was not just physical. It was the feeling of being a ghost in a world of luxury. He often sat alone in the dark, wondering if he was destined to be a servant forever. But even in this darkness, his hands were learning the rhythm of the workshop, and his mind was beginning to see the flaws in the very boxes he was carrying. Louis did not just sweep the dust from the floors of Monsieur Maréchal's workshop. He studied the boxes as if they were ancient, sacred treasures. He spent his afternoons watching how the sunlight hit the grain of the wood and how the moisture of the Paris air made the expensive leather covers swell and soften. He began to ask questions that no other apprentice in the long history of the shop had ever dared to ask. Why are all travel trunks made with these heavy, curved tops? He asked his teacher one quiet morning while they were preparing a shipment for a wealthy countess. The older workers, their faces covered in sawdust, laughed at him and told him to be quiet and keep sweeping the floor. They told him that trunks had always been made that way so the rain would run off the sides when they were strapped to the back of a horse carriage. But Louis had a mind that looked toward the future, and he knew that the world was changing. He realized that curved tops made the trunks impossible to stack on top of each other during a long journey. If a traveler had 10 trunks, they took up the space of 20 because they could not be layered like bricks. He decided in that moment that he would not just be a simple boxmaker who followed old rules. He decided he would be the greatest master of craft in all of France. He began to spend his few free hours, the late nights, when the rest of the city was asleep practicing his stitches in the dark, by the light of a tiny, flickering candle. He experimented with different types of glue and learned the secret strengths of various fabrics and metals. His hands became rough, calloused, and scarred, but his mind became as sharp and precise as a professional blade. The true turning point came on a cold, gray afternoon when a very expensive, custom-made trunk arrived back at the shop. It was completely ruined, its wooden frame cracked, and its silk lining soaked with salt water from a long and difficult sea voyage. The customer was a powerful man with a loud voice, and he was absolutely furious about his lost possessions. Monsieur Maréchal, usually a confident master, stood in silence because he did not know how to fix such complex damage. The wood was warped beyond repair, or so it seemed to everyone in the room. Louis stepped forward from the shadows of the back room and spoke quietly, his voice steady despite his young age. "I have a way to save it, monsieur," he said, looking his master directly in the eye. The other apprentices whispered and shook their heads, expecting Louis to be fired for his arrogance. But Maréchal, desperate to please his wealthy client, stepped aside and gave the boy a chance. Louis worked through the entire night, fueled by nothing but coffee and the fire of his own ambition. He used a new technique he had developed in secret, reinforcing the frame with a hidden layer of poplar wood and using a special waterproof sealant. When the sun rose over the jagged roofs of Paris, the trunk did not just look fixed, it looked stronger and more elegant than the day it was first born. The wealthy customer returned and was so impressed that he paid double the original price. He asked for the name of the craftsman who had performed the miracle. That was the exact moment Louis Vuitton stopped being a nameless apprentice and became a creator. He had found his anima, his inner creative spark, and he realized that his long walk from the mountains had been leading him to this very bench. He was no longer a victim of his past. He was the architect of his own destiny. For nearly 17 years, Louis worked for Monsieur Maréchal, practicing his craft every single day with a level of discipline that few men could understand. He did not seek fame or quick money. He sought perfection in every stitch and every cut of the wood. During these long years, he became the favorite packer of the French Empress, Eugénie de Montijo. He spent his mornings in royal palaces, surrounded by gold and silk, carefully folding the most expensive dresses in the world into heavy wooden boxes. He traveled with the royal court across Europe, observing the reality of the changing world. He saw that the world was moving faster than ever before. Steamships were crossing the Atlantic, and massive iron trains were cutting through the countryside. But while transport was moving into the future, luggage was stuck in the past. It was still heavy, clumsy, and easily broken by the rough hands of baggage handlers at the new train stations. Louis watched as the beautiful dresses he had packed so carefully were ruined by leaking water or broken locks. He knew he had a solution that would change the history of human movement forever, but he also knew that he had to wait for the right moment. In 1854, at the age of 33, he finally decided that the wait was over. With the small amount of money he had saved from nearly 2 decades of labor, he opened his own workshop. He did not choose a hidden alley. He chose a shop at 4 Rue Neuve des Capucines, right in the heart of the most fashionable part of Paris. He hung a small, simple sign outside his door that promised a revolution, safely packs the most fragile objects, specializing in packing fashions. It was a bold claim for a man with a small shop and few workers. But Louis was no longer the frightened boy from the mountains. He was a master who had paid for his knowledge with 17 years of patience. He spent his first months alone in the workshop, working late into the night until his eyes burned and his fingers bled from the thick fabric. He was inventing something the world had never seen. A trunk made of lightweight poplar wood, covered not in heavy leather, but in a waterproof gray canvas he called Trianon. The struggle was not just physical. It was a battle against the traditions of the past. When he first displayed his trunks with flat tops, many people in Paris laughed. They thought the boxes looked ugly and plain compared to the ornate curved trunks of the old era. The wealthy elite were slow to change their habits, and for the first few years, the shop was often quiet. Louis faced many nights of worry, wondering if he had risked all his savings on a dream that no one wanted. He had a wife and a growing son to support, and the pressure was a heavy weight on his shoulders. But he remained disciplined, refusing to lower his standards or return to the old ways of making luggage. He spent his time talking to the porters at the train stations, asking them exactly how trunks were thrown and where they usually broke. He treated every failure as a lesson, refining his designs until they were indestructible. He was building a foundation of quality that would eventually support a global empire, even if the world wasn't ready to see it yet. Suddenly, the Vuitton trunk was no longer a strange, flat box that people laughed at. It became the most desired object in the fashionable streets of Paris. Wealthy travelers, from Russian dukes to American millionaires, realized that their expensive clothes finally stayed dry during long ocean voyages, and their trunks stayed organized in the cramped cabins of steamships. The small shop at Rue Neuve des Capucines could no longer hold the weight of its own success. Louis was no longer just a craftsman working alone at a bench. He was now a global innovator and a leader of men. He decided to open a much larger factory in a place called Asnières, located just outside the city center. He chose this location specifically because he could use the river to transport his heavy materials and finish trunks more quickly to the shipping ports. His name began to appear in the major newspapers across Europe and even across the Atlantic Ocean in New York City. However, this massive breakthrough brought with it a new and very painful problem that Louis had not expected. The world began to copy his genius. Other manufacturers, seeing the sudden popularity of his flat trunks, began to steal his designs. They used the same gray Trianon canvas and his unique rectangular shapes to sell cheap, low-quality imitations to unsuspecting travelers. Louis felt a deep sting of betrayal as he saw his years of hard work, his sleepless nights, and his bleeding fingers being stolen by men who only cared about profit. For a moment, it seemed that the brand he had built with his own blood and sweat might be drowned in a sea of fakes. This was a different kind of battle than the one he had fought on the road to Paris, but it required the same mountain resilience. Instead of spending his precious time complaining or fighting in the slow courts of law, Louis chose to innovate again and again. He realized that to stay at the top, he had to make his products impossible to copy. He created a new pattern, the striped rayé canvas, which was much more difficult for small workshops to replicate. He constantly updated the locks and the internal compartments, always focusing on the future of how humans move through space. He stayed one step ahead of the world's greed by focusing on the one thing a thief could never steal: his absolute commitment to quality. By the year 1867, Louis Vuitton was a world-famous brand, winning gold medals at the Universal Exposition in Paris. The boy who had walked to Paris in rags, sleeping in haystacks and begging for bread, was now being honored by the hands of kings and queens. He had successfully transformed the act of traveling from a chaotic struggle into a beautiful and resilient art form. Louis Vuitton passed away in 1892, but his spirit never truly died. He left behind a legacy that has lasted for hundreds of years and reached every corner of the globe. If we look back at his life, we see a man who started with nothing but the ability to walk and the will to work with his own two hands. He proved that where you start in this life does not define where you will eventually finish your journey. Today, we see his famous initials on bags in every major city in the world, but the true story of Louis Vuitton is not about luxury, fashion, or expensive objects. It is a story about the resilience of the human soul and the power of a single, determined step forward. When we think of the shadow that Louis faced, the cold nights on the road, the death of his mother, and the rejection in Paris, we see that these dark moments were actually the fire that forged his strength. He did not run away from the struggle. He used the struggle to build something that could withstand time. His life teaches us that our greatest obstacles are often our greatest teachers. The flat-top trunk was not just a box. It was a symbol of a man who looked at a problem and saw a solution where others saw only tradition. He reminds us that even when the world laughs at our ideas, we must remain disciplined and true to our vision. My friends, thank you for sitting with me by the fire today and listening to this tale of a very long road. Remember that even the longest journey begins with a simple courage to leave your home and face the unknown. Your path might be difficult, the rain might be cold, and the hills might be steep. But every single step is teaching you who you are truly meant to be in this world. Take a deep breath and feel the strength within you. You are a traveler too, and your story is still being written. Until next time, my friends, sleep well and keep dreaming.